According to our next guest, the discovery of the Americas is one of the great themes of historical literature, and the history of the Spanish conquest and founding of America have been so misread that popular knowledge of these events are really myths. What really happened when Pizarro and Cortez explored the New World, and who was Christopher Columbus? Let's take note with Matthew Restall, Associate Professor of Latin American History, Women's Studies and Anthropology, and Director of Latin American Studies at Penn State. He's the author of 5 books. His most recent is 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest, published by Oxford University Press. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
How accurate is our popular knowledge or history of the Spanish conquest?
Well, I think it's very inaccurate. And I was surprised at how inaccurate it is, and I didn't realize how inaccurate it is until I started doing the research for this book. I was, for example, continually coming across fallacies and misconceptions and the things that I've called myths in the book when I was teaching undergraduates here at Penn State. And I would ask, where did you get these ideas from? And I would then pursue them through the internet sites, for example, television programs on Discovery Channel and the History Channel, and realize how widespread some of these ideas are. For example, the notion that Cortez was able to defeat the Aztecs, to conquer the Aztec Empire, because he came from a superior culture. That the Aztecs were in some sense or other barbarians, that their emperor Montezuma failed as a leader, that he was racked with superstition and fear and so forth. And students are picking this stuff up from current internet sites. They're not going and reading old books from the 19th century, so these ideas are still very much circulating. Sometimes students would tell me they'd learned things in high school. Not quite as bad as, for example, shifting from Cortez to Columbus, that Columbus thought the earth was round and everybody else thought it was flat, but still ideas along those kinds of lines.
You broke this down into the 7 myths of the Spanish conquest, and there is some significance to the 7 myths because there probably could have been 10 or 12 different myths that you could have exploded. Yes,
and I always emphasize when I start talking about this book, whether it's in the classroom or in a setting like this, that I've made up the 7 myths. Now, I haven't invented everything in the book, but I invented this construction of the 7 myths. And why the number 7? It could have been more than that. And as I was writing the book, I realized at various points that I could have broken some of these myths down and ended up with 10 or 20. The reason I chose 7 is because I think it's a little bit of a magic number. It's a magic number in our culture, and there are also examples of 7 being a magic number in some of the cultures relevant to the book, native cultures of the Americas, and so forth. And also, as sort of a practical reason, it means that each chapter is a reasonable length. You can read it in each chapter in 20 minutes if you're a fast reader, and then the total length of the book is about the right length for a book. So there's a sort of a practical consideration as well. Now,
give us an idea of the array of sources that you investigated to come up with what you think is the true story of the Spanish conquest.
Well, the true story, we'll get to the true part in a minute, but I started with archival sources because of the work that I had been done on previous books. So by archival sources, I mean documents written in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries that I found in archives, mostly in Mexico and in parts of Mexico, because that's the area where my previous specialties were, the books that I've written. And to some extent also in Spain, because that's where the Spanish imperial archives are, and mostly in Seville, but also in Madrid. So I started with that kind of material and then moved on to published primary sources. In other words, accounts written by conquistadors themselves that have been published. Many of these have been published in English and are very widely available and are used in the classroom. So I moved on to those, and then from them on to what we might call more sort of popular sources, including television programs,
Hollywood movies,
textbooks, and so on. And at that point, then the source base exploded, and I had to begin to create some limits and actually start writing the book. Otherwise, I'd still be researching it.
Just how accurate were these histories? My sense is that as you read each one, not one is completely factual or it's certainly from one person's perspective.
Right, well that's where the project gets complicated. And in the original version of the book, there was an introduction that was much longer and delved into theory and so forth. And when I started talking about that with the editor of the press, she said, "You're going to lose readers with this introduction here. It's much too academic. This is speaking to a very small audience." So I had to strip that down and try to communicate these ideas in a more direct way, and I think that was a very helpful process for me. And what these ideas are really is to do with the nature of history itself, not just about the history of the Spanish conquest in the Americas, but how history is generated and produced, beginning with the events themselves. While the events are going on, they're being described and promoted or condemned in certain ways, and those ways lay the foundations for how that history develops. With the case of the Spanish conquest, it's unusual for an event that took place hundreds of years ago in the 16th century in that there were accounts being written by people who participated in it and published in multiple languages at the time. And so the foundation for the way in which this history was going to be viewed was laid in a very sort of profound and interesting way, and didn't give subsequent historians much of a chance to change the story. And it hasn't changed that much in the last 500 years.
Okay, you begin in the first chapter talking about Bernal Diaz, a member of the Spanish expedition led by Cortez.
Yeah.
And he wrote what he saw when he first laid eyes on that Aztec city. He said he was literally lost for words. Give us an idea of what he saw and how that was interpreted or written about.
And why it was so amazing to him. Well, I think there were several things going on. One was that the Spanish assumed that they would not be able to find or discover a native society that was as impressive as the ones they'd left behind in Europe. There was not really a racism, I think it's too early in the 16th century to use that word, but certainly an ethnocentrism, that what they expected is that people in the Americas would be barbarians. And there's a little bit of a contradiction because they were also looking for empires and cities of gold and so on. But I don't think they were prepared for something along the scale of the Aztec capital. Tenochtitlan, the setting was absolutely spectacular, with this lake which is now covered by Mexico City, the mountains, volcanoes included all around that lake, and then this city built on an island in the lake, but it covered the entire island, and the island was crisscrossed with canals, so it looked as though the city was floating on the lake. You couldn't really see the land beneath the houses.
And how could barbarians have created such a sophisticated city?
Exactly, and there are hundreds of thousands of people living on that city and in the communities all around the edge of the lake as well. So you've got a beautiful natural setting, an extraordinary scale, the engineering feat of building this city, the canals, the causeways, the whole thing, and Spaniards had never seen anything like it. I mean, there was nothing like it in Europe. The comparisons they're drawing is sometimes to Venice, because Venice has canals, but Venice in terms of scale is much smaller, and you can't get a view of Venice like that. There isn't a high mountain that you can look down on and see Venice. So as they came through the mountain pass, it's almost as though they were sort of up in an airplane getting this aerial view of the city. And something else that's also going on, I think, is that they're tired and frightened. They've been marching for many months, gone through many battles. They've narrowly survived. All the Spaniards have suffered wounds. They're only still alive because they've managed to establish alliances with other native groups.
Now, in your first chapter, which is the myth of the exceptional man, you talk about how could the Spaniards, this band of Spaniards and the natives that you talk about, destroy such a powerful Aztec empire, and really what did happen? Conquer probably is not the right word.
Well, that question is at the heart of this whole project, and that's usually the question that begins any discussion of the conquest. And that's the discussion that was introduced at the beginning of accounts of the conquest by the conquistadors themselves as a way of promoting what they'd done. Say, look, there was only a few hundred of us and we conquered. And they did use the word conquer. We conquered this incredible empire. And then Pizarro and another small group of Spaniards goes and conquers another incredible empire, the Inca Empire in South America. So they promoted it in terms of this extraordinary contrast in numbers. Right? Just a small number of Spaniards with hundreds of thousands of Indians, right, who control this enormous empire. So everything is larger than life and is described in superlative terms.
And the weaponry was exaggerated as well, was it not?
The weaponry was everything was exaggerated, and that essential question is still the one that is put forward in talking about the conquest. And the problem with that question is it sets you off on the wrong footing. Because in fact, the Spaniards were not only outnumbered by native enemies, but they were vastly outnumbered by native allies. That in these huge battles, and we take, for example, just talking about Tenochtitlan or Mexico City, in the final siege of that city and the big battles that took place in the months of 1521, these were battles between tens of thousands of native peoples on either side. The Spaniards were just 400 or 500. Greatly outnumbered, and it's possible that these armies rose to the level of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. And there were Africans with them too. Spaniards brought Africans as slaves, who played a relatively minor role in Cortez's campaign, but in subsequent Spanish conquests in the Americas, there were Africans in the hundreds, playing very important military roles. But they also sort of shoved to the side and ignored.
Now, one reviewer of your book writes that Matthew Restall is one of the leading pioneers of a new approach to the history of the European colonization in the Americas. Describe what you hope to do. Do you anticipate that history books will be rewritten, that the record will be set straight? What is it that you hope will happen?
Well, I think partly that quote is a reference to using native sources, but particularly native language sources. And it's also partly a reference to a previous book on the conquest that I wrote about, that was specifically about Spanish conquest in Yucatan, and was retrieving Maya accounts written in the Maya language about that conquest. And that material, to some extent, is then not, I shouldn't say recycled, but incorporated into this work. By looking at native accounts, particularly native language accounts, we get a different sense of how the conquest was being carried out. And we see it not so much as an unequal conflict between the superior Europeans and the inferior, superstitious natives, but we see it more as a negotiation between people who were in most ways equal. Spaniards did have some advantages. They brought with them infectious diseases which wiped out native peoples by the millions. They brought with them steel swords which wreaked havoc upon native weaponry and body armor and so on. So Spaniards did have advantages. I'm not trying to argue that there were no advantages. Otherwise it becomes hard to explain the events and their outcome. But the word superiority is the one that I'm trying to attack in the book, and I think that's part of what that quote is referring to.
Okay, on that note, we're out of time. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks very much.
We've been talking with Matthew Restall. His book is The 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest. For Take Note, I'm Patty Satalia.
A copy of the program you've just seen can be purchased through Penn State Media Sales at mediasales.psu.edu or by calling 800-770-2111.